Good morning, everybody. I guess we'll get started. I'll put on my reading glasses so I can read the bio. So I'm pleased to introduce Curtis Grymala. And Curtis is the Director of Web Technology at the University of Mary Washington, and he's the principal of 10321 Enterprises, a consulting agency. At UMW, he oversaw the implementation of WordPress multi-network and is currently in charge of the process to migrating to traditional multi-site environments. He's the primary WordPress developer at the university and is responsible for all of the custom code on the UMW website. As a freelancer, he's consulted with the University of Virginia, University of Florida, Southern Arkansas University, University of Michigan, and many others. He's been presenting on WordPress, accessibility, and higher education for more than 10 years, and he is going to wow us with that knowledge today.
Let's hope so. Thank you very much, Sana. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to all of those, anybody that's watching from home or your office or wherever else. So let's start out. We're going to talk. So first of all, this is a 2-hour workshop. If this was a 3 or 4 hour workshop, I'd probably spend the first half hour, 40 minutes or so getting to know everybody else in the room, finding out what's going on with you guys, where you guys are and things like that. With this being a 2-hour workshop, we're going to kind of condense that a little bit. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of time. We'd use up more than half our time figuring out, getting to know everybody else in the room. So I just, understand that I do want to know where you guys are. There will be time to get into specifics and kinds of questions and things like that, but we're not going to spend the first half of the workshop kind of going around getting to know everybody. So just to give you that little heads up. So let's talk a little bit about WordPress and accessibility. Let's start out. Donna gave a pretty good introduction as to who I am. Again, I'm the Director of Web Technology at the University of Mary Washington. And we are a small to medium public university in Virginia, full-time students around 4,000. So I am in charge of all development on the University of Mary Washington website. I'm the WordPress developer there, with the exception of our Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies has their own people that work on WordPress to work on the self-service student, faculty, and staff blogs and things like that. I manage the multi-network instance that we were talking about. I also am managing the new multi-site instances that we're standing up as we're migrating out of that multi-network instance. And I spend a lot of time evangelizing WordPress. The UMW website, at the top level, we have 36 sites in a multi-site network and around 90 active plugins. There are also, on our multi-network installation, we have around 50 separate networks with about 350 total sites spread across those networks. And again, these are sites. These are department sites, marketing sites, university homepage, those sorts of things. These aren't blogs. These aren't staff and faculty websites, those sorts of things. So these are essentially the marketing sites that we're using here. We have about a little over 35,000 published pieces of content throughout the system. That includes 15,000 posts, 13,000 pages, and a bunch of custom content types, for instance, our directory entries and things like that. And a total of about 50,000 attachments across those systems. So we're not talking about enormous like WordPress.com, but we're also not talking about tiny little hobby sites either. So what is accessibility? Essentially, it means that everything should be usable by people of differing abilities. It should be available to everyone, regardless of how they're interacting with that content. They should be able to consume that content. And so it really comes down to universal design. And we're going to talk a little bit about what universal design means and how that affects us and why, and again, why it's important. So why is accessibility important? We're all on some sort of spectrum of ability at this point. There are essentially 4 categories of types of impairments, the differing abilities that we have. There are vision, which can be anywhere from those who have 20/20 perfect color vision to those who are completely 100% blind, those of us that are colorblind, including myself, those that wear glasses of differing prescriptions. Vision impairments or differing abilities with vision can have a huge impact on how people interact with these kinds of things. Then there's also hearing. So, and again, that can go anywhere from someone with tinnitus, so they're constantly hearing a ringing in their ear, to people who are partially deaf, to people who are completely deaf, to people who have kids, and so it's never quiet, and so they can't actually listen to things. Motor abilities. That would be being able to use the interface devices, for instance, touch on your phone or the mouse or the keyboard, things like that. And I mean, I don't know how many of you have experienced trying to use a phone or a tablet when it's not calibrated properly. But imagine trying to touch something and not being able to touch in the right spot. So every time you touched, you were touching the wrong input. Those sorts of things can be, that's kind of an empathy situation for people that don't have fine motor control and can't control those sorts of things as well as many of us can. So again, those are things to be aware of. And then cognitive abilities, that can range anywhere from dyslexia to attention deficit disorder to people simply not being, there are also cognitive disabilities or impairments that can be related to level of education, those sorts of things. And so we have to be aware of all these sorts of disabilities, or differing abilities, as I like to call them. So, as a quick question, so I guess first, if everybody in the room would stand up for a second. All right, so let's start out. If you wear glasses, please sit down. If you've ever broken your arm or leg, please sit down. Nope. If you're sitting down, you stay sitting down. It can still affect your ability to control certain things. So, all right. All right. Let's see. If you're colorblind, go ahead and sit down. Let's see. If you are, let's just say, over the age of 70, if there's anybody in the room, go ahead and sit down. If you're planning on living past the age of 70, please sit down. So we got two who think they're going to die young and leave a pretty corpse. So at this point, what we've seen is that everybody at some point has dealt with or probably will deal with some sort of, differing ability within this spectrum, okay? And that means that first of all, we're not designing for that 5% that may be completely blind, or that 8% that may be completely deaf. We're not standing around going, well, we don't have any blind students, so we don't need to worry about accessibility. Here's a thought. Has anybody here ever tried to use their phone on a sunny day outside? Yeah, it doesn't work so great, does it? They're constantly working on trying to build that adaptive brightness for the things, but it never works quite right, because once you get that sunburst, then all of a sudden your screen goes dark and you can't see a thing. So I mean, that's universal design. It's not simply trying to design for somebody who can't see 100% of the time. It's designing even for those of us that can't see in specific situations. It's not designing for those people that can't, that have never heard a sound in their life. It's designing for those of us trying to use something, for instance, watching a television show while we're riding the bicycle at the gym. You can't hear that TV. Or again, we use captions on our television 100% of the time because, again, we have kids. There's constantly things going on. We miss probably 50% of the dialogue that happens by listening to the television, but we're able to catch back up by reading the captions. So we do those sorts of things. Those are universal design issues. Or let's say you're in your office, you don't have your headphones, and somebody shares a news story, and that news story happens to be a video. That's frustrating to me. First of all, because I'm somewhat on the spectrum of cognitive, ability, where I can't sit and watch a 5-minute video to find out what the headline was about. I'd much rather be able to read the transcript or the news story that goes with it and just skip down to the part I care about, right? But so again, we're not simply talking about designing for these fringe edges with severe disabilities. We're talking about designing for everyone, because we're never, it's extremely rare that we're ever in a perfect environment where we can use things exactly the way they were originally designed to be used. So, what are the rules when we talk about accessibility? And if you guys look at, if anybody's ever spent time, because we love to spend our free time sitting around reading rules and regulations and guidelines, but if you ever spent time trying to look at the web content accessibility guidelines, a lot of times they can be extremely confusing. They can use, they're not good for those with cognitive disabilities. They're not written that way. But we can kind of break it down. Now they break it down into 4 broader categories. The first one is perceivable. So here we're talking about non-text content. That would be images, that would be videos, that would be audio, essentially anything that's not straight up text, okay? We're talking about time-based media. Now again, time-based media, it can be, in this case, they're talking about kind of synced media like videos and audio and stuff like that, where it runs on a specific timeline. But there are also portions of the accessibility guidelines that deal with time-sensitive media. For instance, if you have a contest that's only open until, midnight tonight or something like that, there are accessibility guidelines that go with that sort of thing. If you're talking about your bank, where it automatically logs you off if you don't touch your mouse for 15 minutes, those sorts of things, those are also accessibility concerns that they work with within these guidelines. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You want to make sure you separate your content from your presentation. And this is, it's kind of a credo of the web anyway, and we're always getting our chocolate mixed up with our peanut butter in the web, because our JavaScript is going to output content. You can actually output content with CSS now, so there is always going to be somewhat of a mixture, but you need to make sure that if you didn't have JavaScript, or you didn't have CSS, or you were looking at it on a watch instead of a nice, big, huge computer monitor, that somehow that content can still be consumed separated from the presentation layer that you're creating, okay? And that becomes a universal design thing. It's not simply so that somebody with a screen reader can listen to your content. It's so that you can look at it on your watch, because your watch is not going to display a desktop website. And if it did, you wouldn't be able to see a thing on it. Okay, so you need to consider and work on keeping that content separated from the presentation layer so that it can be consumed outside of the original context and still make sense and still be usable. And at that point, with the perceivable category, the last step is appropriate context and contrast. Okay. Now, contrast, they are specifically talking about colors, backgrounds, that sort of thing. So we need to make sure that we can see your text on the background that you've got it sitting on. And one place where it gets really difficult at times, especially because it can't be automatically tested very easily, are when we put captions over photos, and they're superimposed on the photos and things like that. And that photo goes from black to white, and so we can't see text across that photo and things like that. Those are things we need to keep in mind. Now, when they talk about appropriate context and contrast, especially when they're talking about the contrast, the ideal standard is 7:1 contrast ratio. It's a huge contrast ratio. Designers do not like to hear 7:1 color contrast ratio, but that's the ideal standard, because again, and this color contrast issue is, again, it's not simply for those of us that are colorblind, and I can tell you it can be really frustrating trying to read stuff without proper contrast, but it's also for when you're standing in the sun trying to use your phone or your laptop. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm working from home, every once in a while, I would like to have the option to go sit on my porch and work on my laptop. But the way the laptop interacts with the sun, I can't get any work done that way. And so if we have 7:1 contrast or better, it's going to be a lot easier to work on those sorts of things in a sun, in a brightly lit room with that dark background and everything else. That said, the 2.0 AA guidelines, which is kind of the first standard that you're required to meet at this point, are 4.5:1 for contrast ratio between foreground and background. Now, there are also There are differing standards for large text versus small text. The small text is the 7:1 at the AAA guideline and 4.5:1 at the AA guideline. For large text, they allow you to have slightly less contrast. So at the AAA guideline, at the ideal standard, the large text is 4.5:1, and at the AA guideline, it's 3:1 contrast ratio. But there are no real concrete guidelines as to what qualifies as large text and what qualifies as small text. So that's something else to keep in mind. And then you also have to keep in mind that, again, when we get to potential glaucoma, various vision deficiencies, that it doesn't matter how large the text is, they're still going to have to blow it up and see, in order to read it. My great aunt had macular degeneration. We had to get her, to the point where we could zoom things in so that she could read 2 or 3 letters at a time on the screen. That's how close, on an iPad, a 10-inch iPad landscape version, we had to blow it up so far so that only 2 or 3 letters fit on the screen at a time in order for her to be able to read stuff off of there. So those are things to keep in mind. The second category is operable. We need to make sure everything is keyboard navigable. Unplug your mouse for a while and try and use your website. See how you do. If you can't get through it, it's probably not working right. Okay? Some things you need to be careful of are keyboard traps. So this happens occasionally, especially with like drop-down menus or forms that appear when you focus on something, those sorts of things. You can get into it, and then if you tab, it goes to like the next thing, in that drop-down or whatever, and once you get out of the drop-down, it goes back to the beginning of that drop-down. It brings the drop-down back again, those sorts of things. You have to be careful with those. Modal windows are really bad about this if you're not careful. Once the modal window opens, they can get trapped in there and have no way to get out of it with the keyboard. Again, just because you have a big red X at the top of the box doesn't mean they can find it or get to it with the keyboard. So those are things to keep in mind. It should be keyboard navigable. And so essentially, keyboard navigable is a really good kind of signpost for us. And it's what's built into the guidelines. But essentially what it means is it shouldn't matter what input device they're using. We should be able to use this website. So again, touch becomes a real, touch is not so much built into the accessibility guidelines, but it's still something for us all to be aware of, and probably will be at some point built into the accessibility guidelines. But things like our drop-down menus, that if you tap on them, they, expand the menu, but you can't actually get to the page, the top level page that menu is showing you, because it just expands and collapses the menu when you tap on it. Or those drop-down menus where you can't get to the sub-menu items, because when you do tap on it, it opens it goes to the next page instead of opening the menu. Those sorts of things are things you have to keep in mind, because touch does not have a hover event. There are some pseudo hover events on certain touch devices, but not all. And so you have to be aware of the fact that people have to be able to get to your content regardless of whether they're using just a mouse, just a keyboard, or just a touch device. Or very soon, and in some limited circumstances now, potentially even voice commands. Okay, so these are all things we need, and this is an operable guideline, but it goes back to the idea, again, of making sure that your content is separated, the content itself is separated from that presentation layer. It has to be accessible, and when I say accessible in that matter, I mean you have to actually be able to access it. You have to be able to get to it. Okay. Again, regardless of the input device that they're using. You want to avoid seizures. I think that's a pretty good suggestion for like life altogether. Avoid causing seizures, but there are actually specific guidelines that you can look into to make sure that your website isn't potentially causing seizures. With the setup right now, I can't view my speaker notes, but I'm pretty sure that it says anything that flashes more than 3 times during a second is considered something that could induce seizures. So if there's anything, and I mean, we're not just talking about flashing. So, yes, take away that starburst that blinks new on your website 6 times in a second. But we're also talking about, if you've got a slideshow on your homepage and it's sliding quicker than 3 times a second, that movement can still be considered that kind of flash. If you've got something where you're, lazy loading things in with JavaScript and it's pushing or changing or potentially reloading parts of the page quickly, those are things to consider. We don't want anything flashing more than 3 times a second. Okay. And then wayfinding. This is making sure that at all times they can tell how they got to where they are and how to get back to where they came from. So, one simple thing that a lot of us do, and it's one of those things with the pendulum swing where everybody wants it and then everybody hates it and wants to get rid of it, are breadcrumbs. That's something to keep in mind. But still, even if you don't use breadcrumbs, make sure that, for instance, your navigation menu has a clear indication of this is the active page that you're on, those sorts of things. Potentially even the category that they came from to get there is highlighted on your navigation menus, those sorts of things. They need to be able to find. So if somebody pops into your website and they landed on this page that they thought had the answer from Google, and it doesn't have the answer, they need to be able to tell how to get back to the upper level page that's, that this sits under or something like that. For instance, how many times, I don't know if you guys have done it, but I know I've certainly done it quite a few times. I'm searching for like a contest or a form or something, and Google gives me the search result for the terms and conditions for that contest or that form, and it's like, I didn't want the terms and conditions, I wanted the form that I was going to fill out. And so being able to find how to get back to that thing that this is related to is very important. The third category is understandable. Uh-oh, what did I do? Oh.
That happened in the last presentation too.
That's not, whoa, now there's somebody else on my screen. All right. Okay, so we're going to pause for just a second. Yeah. Okay, so welcome back to the live streamers. I'm sorry if you missed some things, but we'll keep moving on. All right, so essentially when it comes to allow, avoiding, and correcting mistakes, they're talking about things, again, we sort of discussed this a little bit ago, but they're talking about things like, for instance, for forms, first of all, you want to give them clear instructions so that they shouldn't make mistakes in the first place, so that you can do as much as you can to avoid them making a mistake in the first place. So if you've got a form that for some stupid reason requires phone numbers not to have dashes and parentheses in them, let them know before they submit the form. While they're filling it out, give them instructions that you've got these stupid, rigid, unnecessary rules for their data that you could clearly take care of in a different way. But let them know, or if you've got, ID numbers that have to be numbers, let them know that those ID numbers don't include letters, that they're only going to be numbers, things like that. Put that information, instructions in the form itself. Put instructions in interactive elements so that they can avoid clicking on things that they shouldn't click on, or, and to that extent also eliminate the distractions. Don't put things that they shouldn't click on in your interface if you don't want them to click on them. Okay? Which is, and it was really frustrating for a long time at the beginning of the web because every web form had a reset button right next to the submit button. How awesome was it when you spent 45 minutes filling out a form and hit the wrong button and it all went away? So thankfully we've moved away from that. But again, don't put elements there that you don't want them using, because if it's there, they're going to use it. And especially when we get into, and this is another thing, so another thing to be aware of is something really popular in forms nowadays are the honeypot fields. Those are fields that are in the form, but they're hidden from the screen. And if done right, they're hidden from screen readers as well. If done incorrectly, they're not hidden from screen readers. And these forms are meant to stay empty. These fields are meant to stay empty. If there's any content inside this field, then usually the way the honeypot works, it simply rejects the submission. Okay? Some things to keep in mind. A, again, make sure they're hidden from screen readers if you're going to put them in, because someone that's not viewing it on a desktop isn't going to know they're supposed to leave that field blank. The second thing is some browser autofills will autofill that field. I have had myself watched form submissions that I'm putting in go straight into the spam box. Now, thankfully, in our case, it had a spam box. It didn't just send it off into the ether. But I've watched those things go straight into the spam box because I let Chrome automatically fill in my first and last name on the form. And Chrome recognized that field, but something went in there and put something in there. All right, so those are things to be aware of with those honeypot fields. I'm not saying don't use them, but if you're going to use them, first of all, be aware that they need to be, they need to be accessible. Don't let screen readers find them either, because they'll fill them in. And B, just be aware that at the very least, you should have some way to catch those spam submissions and review them rather than just having them disappear altogether. It's also talking about things, for instance, as we started to discuss a little bit ago, it's talking about things like timed forms, being on your bank website and having it automatically log you out 15 minutes after you started. Being in your student information portal and having the timeout ridiculously set at like 30 seconds. Those sorts of things. They're talking about avoiding the possibility that they're going to be automatically logged out. You have to give them some way to extend that, to either turn it off or extend that limit in some way. And that I think that's also part of the next category as well. But, we have to avoid those sorts of things. And then we also have to allow correcting mistakes. So again, if they did fill out a form and they filled it out incorrectly, tell them specifically what's wrong with the data they submitted and how they need to fix it. Don't just say there was an error submitting the form. Say the email address needs to be, have an @ symbol or something like that. Your password needs to have, an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, and a special symbol or whatever. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask this question. So honeypots are really there to allow those who try to fill out forms in an automated fashion to bot. So sitting here thinking about it, it seems to me that the distinction between some automated process like an autofill or a screen reader, I don't know the answer to this, but if there's a way to draw distinction between those three things, right? In other words, if you treat that honeypot in a way that is accessible, then that validates the honeypot field.
All right, so the question is talking about honeypot fields that we were discussing a minute or so ago, and concern over whether making it accessible to things like screen readers and things like that also make it discoverable and avoidable by the types of bots and things like that that we're trying to avoid being able to use these forms. I'm going to be honest and say I don't know. I really don't. I would be happy to do a little bit of research on that sort of thing. I honestly don't know where those distinctions are. Because, first of all, I would say that for very purposeful reasons, there isn't a reliable way to identify that a screen reader is being used. Because if we were, then we'd start ending up with, instead of mobile-only sites and desktop sites, we'd end up with screen reader sites and computer sites and things like that. So, I think it's been somewhat of a conscious decision not to make these screen readers, reliably discoverable. But it's a great question. I honestly don't know whether hiding those sorts of things with the types of, hacks and CSS tricks that we use to reveal things to screen readers would also reveal them to bots. I don't know. But I would still expect that there is probably a way to hide something from a screen reader and still reveal it to a bot. I just can't say for certain.
Yeah. In terms of allowing correcting mistakes in forms, does that also include, not completely clearing the form and making people re-enter all the information if there's a problem?
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, when it comes to allowing correcting mistakes and things like that, especially when related to forms, essentially he's asking if it includes not clearing out that form just because they submitted it and made a mistake. Absolutely, it includes that sort of thing. You know, you should, if they've already completed information, that information should stay in the form after that form reloads with an error, and then they should have the ability to correct that information. So yes, absolutely, it includes that, and yes, that's not only a best practice, but it is part of this accessibility guideline that you shouldn't make them do things over again, especially don't make them re-enter the correct information in the first place. And it needs to be robust. That's the fourth category, which is a really odd category and really broad. But to a certain extent, when it comes to accessibility, what they're talking about here is, you know, it should be proper and valid markup structure. It should be semantically marked up, because that doesn't just make your page easier for, you know, again, to a certain extent, you want to think of a search engine as being potentially a, you know, an accessible type of, you know, aided technology. So, you know, using semantic markup makes it easier for search engines to identify pieces of your page, but it also makes it much easier for those using screen readers and things like that to be able to identify the elements of your page. So, you know, headings should be the proper headings, and that's where it can get potentially tricky, and we'll get a little bit more into that as we go on through this workshop. But that's where it can get really kind of tricky, especially with automated templates and things like that, is trying to figure out what the right heading structure is for things that aren't part of the content you're developing for that specific page. But then also name, role, and value for all interactive elements. Those are, and that can be, it can be somewhat confusing, and there's still kind of a little bit of work being done to identify where things are getting duplicated and things like that. So a role is specifically, you know, it essentially says this piece of the page is meant to be used for this specific purpose. Okay, there are things like role equals button, you know, role equals, I think there's a role equals sidebar or something like that, you know. I mean, and so if you have an input with a type of button, you probably don't need to add the role equals button, because of, you know, unless for some ridiculous reason you're giving it another purpose besides being a button, which people do. But so if it's already a button and it's a button element, it probably doesn't need a role of button, because that can cause some duplication within some screen reader software. But if it's a link and it's meant to be a button, then you'd add the role equals button. You want to give these types of interactive elements specific, you know, roles and values for those sorts of things. So again, a button needs to have, you know, button wouldn't have a value because it's got text in between opening and closing tags, but input type button and input type submit do have values, because that's the text that actually gets displayed within those things. So those are things to keep in mind, that you should use those values appropriately. You know, don't give it a value that's completely different from what people on the screen will actually see. Okay? And HTML names are helpful. Make sure they're valid HTML names. Those can be used to a certain, you know, they can be used potentially for skipping to certain elements within the page, because screen readers do allow skipping to various things. They allow reading specific things. For instance, with screen readers, you can have it just read out the headings on the page. You can have it just read out the links on the page, those sorts of things. So I think at this point, we've got about 5 minutes till the middle of this workshop. So I want to take, at this point, when we've gone over kind of an overview of what accessibility is and what we need to be paying attention to. So if there are questions at this point, I'd like to answer those related to accessibility before we start to kind of dig into what WordPress does with accessibility. Questions, concerns, something I might have done wrong? Lori?
Have you given up there was a recent piece, well, I'm asking because I'm not remembering, around universities being probably the National Federation of Design, and they've done a lot of this kind of work in the past, but I feel like I'm remembering there was something recent about.
Well, I did see an article that was just shared recently about somebody who's got thousands of websites on their radar, and it said something about them being able to essentially file a lawsuit within an hour after being, after identifying it. So, did they? That's a very frightening thing. Yes.
Yesterday afternoon, Jeremy Felt gave a presentation where he talked about Washington State University dealing with an Office of Civil Rights complaint, and they're in the process of overhauling a few thousand websites. Yeah. So essentially for the live stream, the question was if I'd heard anything about the recent potential lawsuits and that sort of thing going after colleges and universities. I've read an article about it. And the gentleman back here was telling us that Jeremy Felt kind of got into that part of it yesterday during his presentation. If you want to watch the recording once it's available, talking about how Washington State is trying to deal with that sort of thing. And still, for us in higher education, kind of the big flagship that we all kind of look at still is Penn State as well. Penn State Penn State went through serious troubles and changes and is still working on remediating things years later after they got sued for accessibility violations. And it's important to point out, the lawsuit at Penn State did not start because of their website. The lawsuit at Penn State started because of touchscreens in classrooms. But once somebody had identified that that was inaccessible, it was a faculty member that was unable to use the touchscreen within the classroom. Once it was identified that that was inaccessible, it went after the entire umbrella of Penn State University, which is, I think, somewhere around 30, 40 campuses, I think, which are almost completely separate universities, but they're all under that Penn State University umbrella. And so it was a huge project. And now, so now it wasn't just the website that got in trouble. It isn't just the website they're remediating. It's everything. But the website is what we have control over. So, yes.
I just want to build on that. I've heard of cases where it went the other way, where the website got flagged for accessibility things, which triggered a full audit of like all the accessibility stuff on campus, so the wheelchair ramps and the braille on the signs. So as web people, we don't want to be the ones responsible for triggering that audit.
Right. Okay, so this gentleman just was talking about the fact that he's also seen situations where it went the opposite way, where somebody identified the website was inaccessible, and that ended up causing serious problems and audits for the physical accessibility on campus and things like that as well. Yes.
Particularly if you're at, say, an older higher education institution in the northeast of the United States, where making buildings accessible would probably be injuriously expensive. It gives you a lot of leeway in terms of
right.
Budget for accessibility.
Yeah, and that's so the point here made was that essentially the fact that it can kind of go both ways and that the website could potentially trigger that sort of an audit and that sort of a process can work in our favor to get that kind of budgetary support that we need in order to examine and work with accessibility on our websites. I think that's a great point. I think there are still, unfortunately, very few schools where they recognize that. And so, as an aside here, I will mention that in a lot of cases, at least for the automated type of accessibility testing, I mean, getting a full accessibility audit is going to be very tough for any of us to sell, unfortunately. And again, Penn State spent probably millions of dollars getting that done professionally after the lawsuit. But most of us aren't going to be lucky enough to have a windfall to be able to go out and get a professional accessibility audit and those sorts of things. But at the very least, the automated accessibility testing tools, they only identify about 5% of the total issues, but they can identify hopefully that low-hanging fruit and that really, the big type stuff that we may need to look into. And so I will say that a handful of the better automated accessibility testing tools also do other things that are potentially more politically popular. So for instance, and we'll get into some of the tools later as well, but one of the tools that we like to use is a system called SiteImprove. And accessibility is just one small thing that it does. It does accessibility testing, but it also does broken link checking. It also does spelling and grammar rules checking. It also has some very nice analytics built in and that sort of thing. But that spelling checker and that broken link checker is how we were able to convince the higher ups that we needed it. We wanted the accessibility testing, but that spelling checker was more important to the higher ups. So that's how we sold it. And so if you, there are a number of suites that come that way. So you might be able to convince the right people, you can use individual pieces of that suite to convince the right people that you need that kind of support. So let's start talking about WordPress and accessibility, and we'll start out by talking about what WordPress does well. So, oops. All right, so let's talk about what WordPress does well. To start out with, WordPress out of the box with the default theme, with no images and no interactive elements, no videos, nothing like that. So it's just straight text. It's great. It's wonderful. I mean, it really is on the front end. As long as you don't customize the color scheme on the new default theme, you're good. It's almost perfect for accessibility. And it does very, yes. 2017? Yes, 2017 in this case. Though it's been pretty good on accessibility, probably at least back to the 2013 theme, possibly even before. There were, with the introduction of the customizer, allowing you to customize color schemes in 2017, that introduced some real potential contrast issues. In fact, one of the default color schemes that was supposed to come with it was horribly inaccessible. And I went round and round with one of the developers about that because it looked nice, but you just couldn't read it. So, and again, so it does allow the customizer, you can set foreground and background colors and those sorts of things with 2017 within the customizer. And so there's the potential there to really make it bad. Now that said, the back end of WordPress is pretty good at accessibility. There are always going to be some issues, but they're pretty well committed to identifying those potential accessibility issues within the back end. There are things they're working on to make better. I don't know if you've tried to use it or not, but some of the drag and drop interactive elements in the back end, for instance, the widget area, you can turn on an accessibility mode that allows you to tab through and choose, like, move this right, move this left, move this up, move this down, move this to another sidebar, that sort of thing. It looks very clunky, but it works. So I mean, that could certainly be improved, but it's functional in an accessibility way, in an accessible way. There are other elements that they're still working on improving. And one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit more detail later, but one of the things that can be a real serious accessibility issue is simply tables that aren't used for tabular data. And so especially once people start to nest tables, because with assistive technology like screen readers and things like that, they don't see just the presentation. They have to dig into each of those tables. And so they're getting further and further into those tables. And so there are still some things within the WordPress backend that are using more tables than they should for things that aren't really tabular data. For instance, I mean, basically any settings page that uses the settings API within the backend is being output as a table. So, and those are things that they're working on. It's an identified issue that they're working on fixing, but it's not a huge issue, so it's lower down the rung of things that they're working on fixing. And the settings API is something they're working on anyway because it needs to be revamped in a lot of ways. But yes.
with the way WordPress works, if they update the settings API, does that retroactively improve pages, like settings pages that were built with it?
Okay, so the question is, if WordPress core updates the way the settings API works, will it retroactively fix other settings pages throughout? If those settings pages use the settings API properly, yes. So yeah, I mean, it's built in such a way so that, yeah, the way the settings API works is you're essentially feeding it a label and a field, and then it outputs the output around, you know, the HTML around that to build that table structure or the label structure or whatever it does. So it should fix that. Now, that said, there are quite a few plugins that decided to kind of match the way the settings API outputs its information, or that have just gone ahead and done something completely different and that sort of thing. So, but things that are using the settings API to output the information would retroactively be fixed once WordPress was updated. All right, so some potential gotchas we've got to watch out for, especially within WordPress. Heading levels, like I said, you know, anybody with a sidebar probably has a bunch of level 3 headings, potentially level 4 headings. That's just because, you know, you never really know. So you've got that sidebar over there. You don't know whether they're just going to have an H1 in the content of the page, whether they're going to have an H1 and an H2 in the content of the page. You know, so it's just trying to, the reason the widgetized areas use those heading levels for like 3 and 4 and potentially even 5, but not really, is simply because they're trying to get low enough that it doesn't get thrown into the outline of the page within the content. But there's no good programmatic way to say this should be this way. Now, there are still kind of two schools of thought from an HTML5 perspective as to how this kind of stuff should work. HTML5 is meant to be, according to some, something where essentially you'd never use a lower level heading. Everything would be an H1 because everything's going, that heading level, you know, everything's going to be wrapped semantically so that, you know, an article will have an H1. Then potentially a section within that article would have its own heading, but you're starting over again because that section is a new element that could potentially be pulled out. And so it starts over again with an H1. So almost everything would be an H1 unless you were specifically applying a subtitle to something. So if you have, you know, the name of the newspaper article and then the subheadline or something like that, that could be an H1 and an H2. It's gone back and forth in the HTML5 discussions as to whether something should be that way or not. I think at this point it's more not than should. And so we're back to kind of properly nesting and labeling our heading levels. But theoretically, it's going to be possible potentially sometime in the future for heading levels just to be headings and the actual semantic structure to determine what level it really is. So, link titles. For the most part, links should not have a title attribute. Screen readers will read the title attribute and the text within that link. So it's really annoying to people using screen readers when somebody applies a title that says exactly the same thing as the link text, because it all gets read twice. Titles also are not completely reliable. They're a good way to expose information to a select few, but not all assistive technology is going to identify or read that title. And again, some will read multiple things over and over again because it potentially gets duplicated in ways. So titles, for the most part, the title attribute within links, for the most part, is something that we want to potentially just leave out or take out. If the information is important enough that it needs to be presented to users in some way, it shouldn't be hidden in an attribute that way. So link titles, you shouldn't have click here as the link text and then have a title be like, click here to read more about this particular article or something like that, because that doesn't help anybody. Okay. So that's the next point, link descriptors. Again, screen readers are able to simply read out the links that are on a page. Okay. and it only reads out the text within that link. So if you have a link where the text inside those A brackets is click here, if you have 5 links on your page where the text inside those brackets is click here, somebody tabbing through with their screen reader is going to get click here, click here, click here, click here, click here. And that didn't help any of us figure out what they're clicking on. And use descriptive text within those links. At this point, most people should know that they're tapping or clicking on a link as long as that link is identified in a way that links should be identified. Okay? I mean, if it's a shade lighter with no underline or something like that, then you've got bigger issues than just the fact that it doesn't have descriptive text. Okay? But again, you know, and it's pretty silly at this point to use click here because not everybody's clicking anymore. In fact, probably only about 20% of us are clicking on things at this point. So it's a silly anachronism that's really inaccessible. And even worse is when people are using just here, you know, a single 4-letter word and at that point, so the other half of that is we're not just talking about screen readers. Make that descriptor, make that descriptor work essentially out of context, and make it so it's long enough so that, you know, again, if I have any kind of fine motor control deficiency, trying to click on a 12-pixel 4-letter word is really hard. I don't have any fine motor control deficiencies, and I can't click on it half the time. You know, yes?
I was going to say, on the opposite end, what would you say in a nutshell is the absolute most ideal way to go about an article about climate change? What's, here's more about that, how climate change is affecting
right.
Antarctica. I mean, like how
yeah. Oh, yeah. So his question is kind of what's the ideal way to kind of use link descriptors and what they should be essentially for things like articles where you're saying read more and that sort of thing. It's a tough question, and it's something where in an ideal world, we'd be kind of handcrafting each individual read more link so that we could say something in a kind of summarized way rather than read more of and this 27-word title of the article. We could just say read more about this kind of concept and that sort of thing. So in an ideal world, potentially the headline would be linked anyway, and then the very next link they're going to get to is going to say read more, and we could give a very short summary of what the concept is for that article or something like that. So you're right. If one of the, if the headline is, scientist discovers that climate change is, increasing tenfold or something like that, then the read more could be read more about this research on climate change or something like that. We're not handcrafting each of our link descriptors for read more. Read more is not necessarily horrible in those situations if we're also linking to the titles and things like that above, to the headlines of the articles above and things like that. It's not ideal, and again, it would be something better to be like read more about this subject. But yeah, it's a very fine line where essentially none of us are going to be able to test it and go, that's right. It's more a thing of, as long as we're trying and we're making an effort to make it understandable all by itself, then we're doing better. And it's kind of like the old Supreme Court case. I guess it was about the difference between pornography and art. I can't tell you, but I'll know it when I see it. And that's the sort of thing. It's like we can't write guidelines to say that link descriptor text should be this many characters or this many words or, but it's just one of those things where, yeah, if that was the only thing on the page you could read, would it make sense to you? Would you know what to do with that? And that's kind of the guideline you want to work from with those link descriptors. So. And then alt attributes. This is probably one of the most confusing and hotly debated subjects in accessibility are those alt attributes. So I want to, and if you take nothing else away from this presentation, I want you to at least take this away. Okay, there are essentially, you can think of alt attributes in somewhat of a decision tree, and there's actually a good one on, I think it's on the Section 508 website. But, you know, essentially, does this image contain text? If so, then the alt attribute should be the text that's contained within that image. If not, then we move on to the next thing. Does this image convey context? So, for instance, is it a button that, you know, it's a big arrow that everybody knows means go to the next page unless you can't see that arrow, you know? So then if it's conveying some sort of context, then the alt attribute should be what that's going to do. Now, it gets a little tricky when that image is something inside of a link, because there are some discrepancies between link title attributes and image alt attributes. For the most part, the recommendation appears to be to use the image alt attribute and again leave the link title attribute out altogether. Okay, so use that alt attribute just like you would use text to let them know they're going to the next page or they're submitting the form or something like that. Okay, then at that point, the third level, I believe, in the decision tree is it would be if it's conveying, you know, so we've got if it actually contains text, if it's, you know, if it conveys context, and then the third one I believe is kind of is it adding to the content in some way that the content wouldn't make sense without that image. So again, it's still sort of conveying context, but it could be, you know, it's a slightly different pattern than this is a button that takes you to the next page. It's more like, you know, especially it could be something like this is a screenshot I took of a chart, you know, or something like that. Those are things that are conveying context. They are conveying content. They don't necessarily include text, because it could be that, you know, you've got a caption under it that says, you know, this color represents this thing or something like that. And that's a whole different issue that we can discuss in depth a little later about how charts and things like that should be presented. But, you know, those sorts of things that don't necessarily contain text, but they are still content that needs to be consumed in some way, where things don't work or make sense without that image. So at that point, then you should be describing in some way what that content is, and potentially even linking off to more information about that so that they can read it in some way. And then at that point, if it hasn't matched any of those three categories, then the alt attribute should be blank. It is required to have an alt attribute. And a lot of people think that means it's required to have an alt attribute with a value in it. It's not. Okay, so don't describe your photo as man standing next to other man. That's a terrible alt attribute. Unless you're the Onion, in which case that might have been the headline. But, you know, that's not something that conveys the content of that image. So if an image is purely illustrative or decorative, it should have an empty alt attribute. Yes.
Does an empty alt attribute have to still have the equal sign and the quotes, or does it operate without?
It does not, according to HTML5 specification. Well, according to HTML specifications. People that are still kind of halfway in between the XHTML and the HTML specifications and things like that, you know, myself included, we like to make things consistent and look pretty. So, you know, it is not required to be valid HTML anymore. It simply needs to have the alt. I believe. I'm not going to say that with authority. I can say that with authority from an HTML5 validity standpoint. I can't say that with 100% authority from an accessibility standpoint, but I'm about 95% sure it could just be alt. Now, WordPress is going to insert an empty alt attribute for you anyway, but the thing to keep in mind is WordPress will insert what, you know, if you type in text in the alt window, the alt input while you're inserting media, WordPress is going to use that as the alt attribute. So don't use that as a descriptor of the photo, like man standing next to other man. You can use that as your description. You can use that as your title of the image, something like that. But don't use that as your alt text within the alt input, because WordPress is going to use that as the alt input. There are still some rare situations where WordPress tries to use a backup for an alt attribute if the alt attribute is empty in the input. For the most part, those of us, those that are involved explicitly in WordPress core are still working on identifying that. And it's something else that if you happen to notice that WordPress is doing that, it might not be a bad idea to open a ticket about that sort of thing, because that is an accessibility problem, where if the alt attribute, it used to be years ago, if the alt input was blank when you inserted media, WordPress would use the title as the alt attribute instead, which I don't know about you guys, but for 99% of our media, the title is something like DSC 3605 bracket 1 bracket .jpg. That's a horrible title. And it's an even worse alt attribute. So, WordPress is moving away from, and has mostly moved away from, those default backups of alt attributes and things like that, so that if the alt input is empty, it inserts an empty alt attribute. But it was just there were 100 different ways to get to that media insertion, process. And so there may still be 1 or 2 avenues that weren't figured out yet. 2 years ago, I found one and identified it and submitted a patch for it. But that doesn't mean, there may not be at this point any of those left, but it's just a possibility to keep an eye on. But for the most part, WordPress should insert an empty alt attribute if you leave that alt input empty. And again, that's going to be, for us, since all of our images are simply to make the page look pretty, probably 95% of our alt attributes are empty, because they convey no meaning or context or content whatsoever. They're just there to make it look prettier. Yeah. Okay, so his question is essentially, if an image has a caption that you would you want to present that, or would that have value as an alt attribute? It doesn't have value as an alt attribute, because, now the only time it would ever have value as an alt attribute is if that caption were embedded in the image rather than being an HTML caption. Now, that said, this goes back to the semantic markup of things, and WordPress is still not doing this on its own. And I don't, honestly, with a WYSIWYG editor, I don't know how you get there to the point where it does do this kind of thing on its own. But within HTML5, there is a figure element that if you're going to have an image and a caption, or even a table and a caption, or a chart and a caption, or pretty much anything that is data that's used, to tangentially connect to the content of the page, you would use the figure element to wrap that, and then there's a fig caption element underneath. So, any screen reader that recognizes HTML5 is going to find that figure, and it's going to automatically identify that caption as being related to the element that's inside the figure. WordPress still marks up things pretty well when you're automatically inserting media for images and captions and things like that. So no, that caption, as long as it's properly connected to that image, there's no point in having the alt attribute, because otherwise, if you're on a screen reader, what you're going to hear is it's going to read that alt attribute, and then it's going to read exactly the same text as the caption. So as long as, again, when you think about it, somebody using assistive technology like a screen reader is never going to even know there's an image there, really. They're just going to hear text. And so if that text immediately follows that image anyway as a caption, there's no reason to use it as an alt attribute. Doug, you had your hand up next.
So just for clarification, if we've got a faculty bio page with a picture of the professor. It's not necessary or advisable to fill the attribute saying photo of Professor so-and-so. And then from an SEO standpoint, the old mindset used to be that that was beneficial for populating search.
It's a valid question. So the question is essentially, for instance, for like a bio, faculty bio page, whether or not we should have alt attributes that say potentially like photo of, such and such faculty member or something like that, and how that squares with SEO and that sort of thing. It's a great question. It's something where there are a lot of different ways to approach that. One would be that, first of all, if someone's using a screen reader, they're probably not going to be able to see what the person looks like anyway, so having the photo on the page doesn't help them identify that faculty member when they walk into their office. But, it still wouldn't hurt to have some sort of identifier with that photograph, but it doesn't necessarily need to be an alt attribute. It could be simply a caption under that says their name, or, there are, in a lot of cases, I think if I were doing this, and I probably need to look at the way we're doing this, but if I were doing this, I probably would have a little caption under it that said that. But even if not, the title on the page for it being a bio page is going to let people know from a context perspective that are viewing the page that that photo is of that faculty member. So from an SEO standpoint, it's questionable as to whether having that information within an image is really all that helpful. And it's not more helpful than having a caption associated with that image. So it may be, I can't say for certain that it's less helpful, but it's not more helpful than having a caption associated with that image, especially, again, assuming that things are marked up in a way that search engines can understand. So yes.
So going back to your man standing next to a man example, so you have a decorative page that does not have a title, does not have a description, does not have a caption. Isn't it helpful for somebody who's using a screen reader to know that that is a picture of a man standing next to a man, especially if maybe they're not completely blind, but see something vague, to be able to, rather than having absolutely nothing.
Right. So the question is kind of whether it would be useful to somebody, for instance, with only 5%, vision or something like that, so that they can see a blurry spot on the page, whether or not it would be useful to have an alt attribute, something like man standing next to man or something like that, a descriptor for the image. Potentially, yes, but, and honestly, I can't say this with authority. I can say with authority that for the most part, the recommendation is for decorative images, you leave an empty alt attribute. Whether or not it could be potentially helpful to those that can kind of see a blob and are still using a screen reader and that sort of thing, it's possible. Now, again, whether or not literally putting man standing next to man would be helpful to them or not. If maybe it was something like Jim Luke standing next to Jesse Lavery, it might be a slightly different story. But even then, it's still, again, and that's where it can get a little tricky, is deciding what is decorative and what is conveying, actual context or meaning or something like that. And it can be very tricky. But for instance, on our, getting back to these sliders that we all love so much on our home pages, assuming that your slider is something that has like, each image has like a heading and an article synopsis or whatever under it, then those images need an empty alt attribute, because the heading and the article synopsis are what's conveying the meaning, and they're already text. As long as it's not text embedded in an image. So as long as they're text that's kind of being superimposed over the image with HTML, those images should absolutely have blank alt attributes, because they're going to take away from the headline and the article synopsis rather than adding to it. it comes down to a matter of how much you think something's going to add to the content and how much something could potentially detract from the content. And so, like you said, an image that potentially is showing, you know, Jim standing next to Jesse or something like that, that could potentially, but at the same time, if that was something that you wanted to convey, even to a small edge case, a caption would probably make more sense. So I don't think you're helping anybody with, again, a very generic caption like, you know, 3 men standing next to a television. But if you were to identify those men, or you were to tie the context of why that television was important to the story, then that could be a caption that went with it and actually contributed, as opposed to simply, you know, and I know if we're very, very, very lucky, we can get student helpers to come in and start cataloging all the photographs that we have somewhere on a shared drive. And those students don't know who any of these people are in the photographs. So you end up with photos that literally have the title or caption or, you know, whatever within Adobe Bridge as their tags or metadata as man standing next to man. I have seen that as the, you know, the description of a photograph, multiple photographs, you know, and that gets really old when you got man standing next to man. Man standing next to man 2, man standing next to man 3. You know, it's like this did not, you know, it's wonderful that somebody went through and cataloged all our photographs, but it's really not helpful unless I'm just looking for a picture of a man standing next to a man. I mean, if I'm looking for a picture of Jim Luke, I'm not going to find it among the man standing next to man photos. So, you know, and those are the kinds of things to keep in mind when you talk about that kind of stuff. So.
Well, my follow-up is one of the things we're considering is should we have a rule by a plugin that requires people to fill in the alt field when they insert media.
Okay, so the question is, should we have some sort of a rule via something like a plugin that requires somebody to enter text in the alt field when they're inserting media? It's not a bad idea, but again, because of the fact that decorative images should have empty alt attributes, it can't be absolute. One of the plugins I'll talk about at the very end when I have my slide of resources available does have, you know, it does, if you just insert an image and you haven't filled out the alt attribute, then it will actually put in a big, ugly image underneath that says, you know, all images are required to have alt attributes or something like that. There is a checkbox, however, that you can check to say this image is purely decorative, so that if you check that box, it will not do that. Now, it requires the user interaction to say, yes, this is decorative. Now, that doesn't mean that your content managers aren't going through and just checking that box every time they insert images. I don't know, but at least it causes, at the very beginning at least, before they get conditioned to it, it causes that thought process to happen. But it also comes down to hopefully being able to train those content managers as to what is decorative and what's not decorative, because we don't want them checking that box if they're inserting a picture of a chart from a study that was done. We don't want them filling out alt data if that image, you know, if that alt data is going to take away from the context of the, you know, of the page and those sorts of things. So it's something where it still needs to be training and some thought needs to be put into it. But from a purely programmatic, how can we at least try to stem some of this standpoint? Yes, a plugin like that is really not a bad idea. And like I said, there's one accessibility plugin that I'll talk about at the very end that does that. That's one of the features in it. I also know that Chris Wiegman down at University of Florida was just trying to work on some code to specifically do that part, apart from all the other accessibility things that this other plugin does. So he's thrown together some code. I haven't even looked at it. But he's thrown together some code. I don't know how production ready it is, but it really basically just requires you to either fill in the alt attribute or check a box to say that it's not, you know, that it's decorative. So if that was one specific thing you were looking for, potentially we could find his code and look at it and see, you know, how well it works. If you want some of the other accessibility features, then you may want to go with the WP accessibility plugin that adds quite a few other options and features. All right, so those are our potential gotchas within WordPress. And I'm glad, you know, and again, that alt attribute thing is an important discussion, and I'm very glad that we spent a lot of time talking about that, because it can be very confusing and very frustrating. So where do things go bad in WordPress? Well, pretty much anywhere that's not just straight text in the out-of-the-box WordPress. But, you know, again, images, we've spent a lot of time talking about images, but videos can be a very big gotcha. I don't know about you guys, but I know we get requests all the time to add videos to pages, or, you know, people just add videos to pages because it's so simple to do within WordPress. You know, people just adding videos to pages, and those videos those videos are non-text content. They have to have some sort of alternative text content to go along with the video. And so we have to hopefully try to find a way to train people to know that they shouldn't be embedding video unless that video has a transcript and or captions and subtitles and those sorts of things. Or we need a way to identify when somebody's inserted a video so that we can go back through and check to see if they've added transcripts or captions or anything like that. Because again, you know, from two perspectives when it comes to video, you know, the example I gave earlier is somebody sends me, you know, I see this really eye-catching headline or whatever on Twitter, and I click through and I get a 5-minute video that I don't have the time or energy to watch. Even if that video has subtitles or closed captions, I'm probably still not going to really want to watch that 5-minute news video to try and read the captions to see what's happening. So there are cases where a transcript is much more valuable and important to go with that, but that doesn't mean that captions still aren't required. Okay, so we need to have captions and transcripts in a lot of cases. Transcripts are not always required, but you know, that alternative to non-text content is required in a lot of different ways. So, and then plugins, essentially any plugin that outputs HTML could potentially be outputting inaccessible HTML. So that's where it gets really difficult to start to identify, is this helping me or hurting me? And so you think about anything that's a shortcode, anything that's a widget, that's outputting HTML somewhere on the front end, and so it could be making things less accessible for you. So those are things you've got to watch out for. Oops, okay. All right, so this is that alt decision tree I was talking about, and once you get to my slides, which the URL is down at the bottom of the page, if you go to my slides, the alt decision tree is a link that you can click on. And I realize the irony of the fact that the template that I'm using for this presentation doesn't highlight links with anything but color, but I'm not a designer, so I use things out of the box in a lot of cases. But again, does it contain text? Does it convey meaning? Does it contribute meaning or context, or is it purely decorative? Those are those things to keep in mind when looking at deciding whether something needs to have content within its alt attribute.
One quick question.
Yes.
While WordPress gives alt tags, it's up to each theme then to where that figure tag would come in. It's different.
Right. Well, so the question is whether or not there are themes, or whether it's theme dependent as to whether or not things use the figure HTML5 element. It would be potentially theme dependent, yes, but even then, that's only going to be things that are within the theme. It's not. It's possible, but extremely unlikely that any of them are filtering the WordPress caption shortcode and outputting figures that way. Again, and there may be, you know, and there may be some, there may even be plugins that are doing that. And quite honestly, I haven't looked at the source code for a little while, so it may be that it's doing that at this point in like 4.7 or whatever we're up to at this point. I don't think it is. But I think, for instance, like Jetpack, when you use some of its gallery features and stuff like that, I think that it outputs them as figures. I'm not 100% sure. So it depends on where you're inserting it, what it's a part of, And so then there could be themes and or plugins that are changing that information and actually outputting it as an HTML5 figure element. But that doesn't mean it's definitely doing that. So, so videos, you want to find a video script, video script. In this case, I'm meaning like JavaScript, not a script for your video. So you want to find some sort of JavaScript feature or a provider that supports subtitles and captions. Okay, YouTube does. Okay, YouTube actually is really, really handy because if you have a video with pretty good, clear sound, YouTube can use the same technology that your Android phone uses to give you visual voicemail, the same technology that Google Voice uses to give you visual voicemail, and essentially the same technology that your Android phone uses for OK Google. Hopefully I didn't just set off anybody's phone. Sorry, Mike. But anyway, it can use that same technology to recognize the speech that's happening within the video and transcribe a large portion of it for you. Then you can download that transcript and fix the parts that are wrong and then reassociate it with the video. So YouTube is a pretty full-featured transcriber and subtitle and caption editor at this point. So it can be extremely handy for that sort of thing. They've made huge progress in the last 3 or 4 years at YouTube for those sorts of things. Vimeo, originally when I was writing this presentation, I first wrote that Vimeo does not, but I wanted to check and make sure I was correct, and it appears that Vimeo does now. I don't know how recent of an addition that is, but last time I had checked Vimeo 6 or 8 months ago, I couldn't find any information about Vimeo supporting subtitles and captions. So it appears to be a fairly new addition, either that or it's a really well hidden feature within Vimeo. Because this was the first time I'd ever seen confirmation that Vimeo does support subtitles and captions. HTML5 video, if you're building your own kind of interface for video and you're embedding it straight on your page without any other provider, HTML5 video natively supports captions, but it's in a pretty specific format. There's a VTT format, which is essentially a video transcript text or video transcribed text or something like that. That's essentially a proprietary format made specifically for HTML5, and it needs to be laid out in a certain way. But there's plenty of information on the web as to how you can, structure your video tags within HTML5 to support subtitles and captions. So if you're just outputting straight up HTML5 video, you can add in those caption files and those subtitle files for that sort of thing. And then also another really cool tool or service you can look at is something called Amara. It's a website. It's a website intended for you to kind of crowdsource translations of your captions and and subtitles, so that other people throughout the world can just look for a video they want to translate, and they can find your transcript and translate it to another language if you want them to. But as part of that service, Amara provides a video wrapper, essentially their own video player, that then pulls in the captions that you've already got uploaded to that, to that system within Amara. So it can wrap a YouTube video or a Vimeo video or an HTML5 video or whatever in its own wrapper, its own video player that then supports the captions that you have associated with that video. So it's a hosted solution. There are, I believe, pricing tiers, although I've only ever used the free version. I don't know, I can't say for certain that there are paid tiers, but I think there probably are. But anyway, so it's something where now WordPress doesn't natively support, at least not last time I checked, embedding Amara videos, but it's, I wrote an OEmbed plugin for Amara in like 30 seconds. It was like one line of code to make it possible for us to embed Amara videos in our WordPress site. Jim.
Do you know or anything else in the room know about Kaltura?
Jim is asking whether or not Kaltura supports it. I do not know. Does anybody else here know?
Supports what specifically?
Transcript or captions and subtitles, essentially. Without, now let me make a distinction here that there are a lot of video editors and hosts and stuff like that where you can certainly upload burned in videos so that the subtitle, you know, that's subtitles. It's not closed captioning. It's not something that can be turned on and off if it's burned into the video. I don't know whether Kaltura allows you to kind of flip captions on and off or not.
I'm not the Kaltura expert at my job,
Yeah.
but we do work with Kaltura. I know it does transcriptions pretty well. But as far as, I don't know,
Okay.
we work with it and it seems to suit most of our needs. And we're doing this whole accessibility overhaul. And I think it's progress in all those areas. I'm not the expert.
Okay. All right. So there's a potential that Kaltura does. He's saying that it does transcriptions pretty well and that sort of thing, but we can't say for certain whether you can turn captions on and off with Kaltura. So it's something. Now, the biggest point here is to make sure that those transcripts and captions are accurate. A script for a video is not sufficient to be a transcript or captions because, you know, unless every person in that video said exactly what they said, what was written in the script. If there's any ad-libbing or changes, you need to go in and add those things to it. So again, it's important that they're accurate. And it, you know, I'll be honest, even, you know, especially as somebody who can hear and is reading the captions when I'm watching television, it drives me nuts when the captions say something different than what somebody said. And it's really crazy because I have quite a few of the older Godzilla films, and the captions that I have with them are they're really good English translations of the original Japanese. You know, they're very readable, but that's not what the actors are saying, because in the Toho Godzilla films, they tried to match the English-speaking parts with the way the Japanese actors' mouths were moving, you know, to still make sense in context. But it's very different words that they're using when they're speaking and what the captions of the translated Japanese are saying. So it's kind of wild. But so those are things, yes. So those are things to keep in mind. It's just, again, it should be accurate and you know, and it should be descriptive as well. So yes.
Kind of a related point, we of course caption our videos on our YouTube channel for accessibility purposes, but our office level engagement pointed out that they rely on captions quite a bit when they're talking to non-native English speakers, both in America and internationally.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not a ability or disability issue, it's a language issue. So
Yes.
mistakes in captions, and people are trying to use them as a way to help them either learn English or understand more about institutions that don't speak English.
That's a great point. So what Lori was saying is that even not necessarily for being able to hear or not hear, not from an accessibility standpoint, but from a translation standpoint, from an internationalization standpoint, it's important that those captions are accurate, because they can't be accurately translated and could end up with completely different meaning if the captions are inaccurate and they're translated inaccurately. So we've all seen those funny, you know, instructions that come with cheap products that were written in English, translated to Chinese, and then translated back to English. You know, and so we've all seen those, and that's what can happen when, you know, if your transcripts are inaccurate. So, all right, so we only have a couple minutes left. I want to go through a couple things we can do to make this easier. One is plan. Start with a good foundation. Choose a good theme. There's a slide in there that talks about the fact that the default themes like 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, those sorts of things are fairly good at accessibility. Genesis by Studio Press is really committed to accessibility. That doesn't mean that all of their themes are perfectly accessible, but Genesis, the parent theme that they base them off of, at this point has a lot of nice accessibility features built into it. But again, what your designers do with your color palettes could completely ruin that. So be careful with those color contrasts and things like that. Evaluate plugins before using them. Try, you know, again, install it on, even if you install it on your own private site or whatever, install it there. Just at least check over the code and see if it's, you know, throwing out something that really shouldn't be. And build accessibility into all processes. Okay, this should not be something where you finish the project and then you go, all right, now let's check and see what the accessibility looks like. You know, because like you said, you guys are in the process of an audit and a remediation and stuff like that right now. And that's a whole heck of a lot more work and a lot more difficult than just working with all steps of the process as we should. And again, I know this is not a perfect world. None of us are doing this all the time. But ideally, we should be built into all steps in the process so that we don't ever, so that we're not even ever given a theme that's built with poor color contrast because we were involved with the designers in the first place, making sure that they didn't use poor color contrast in the design. I hit the wrong button. All right, train yourself. Obviously this is a good start, but this is a very high level overview. Continue training yourself. There's, one thing that I recommend is there's Environment for Humans does an accessibility summit every year. It's a virtual conference. I think it's usually a 2-day virtual conference. So you get 2 full days of accessibility experts talking about things. And they sell like room tickets for these virtual conferences as well. So even if your whole office wouldn't necessarily benefit from 80% of the presentations, there may be 1 or 2 presentations that they could benefit from, in which case it might be worth it to buy a room ticket and watch the Accessibility Summit together. There are a lot of other, there are ally camps and things like that as well that you can look at attending, and obviously continue reading. So, develop your own training to try and help at least with some of the things that are major issues for you guys. And point users towards established accessibility training. So like I said, potentially if there's one session in that accessibility summit that can apply to a larger group, maybe get that group together and have them watch it together and that sort of thing. And then these are some plugins you can look at. And I think unfortunately we're out of time at this point, so I'm going to leave this up here for a moment. And again, you guys have links to my slides. So these 4 plugins are linked within the slides. These are some services you can look at, and they're linked within the slides. Yep. Oh, yeah, I'll go back up to the plugins for a second. All right. And then here are some good accessibility resources for you to look into, and we'll leave it there. So if anybody, I'll be around, obviously, for the rest of the day and at the karaoke for a while tonight. So if you guys have questions or need to talk, please feel free. I'm here, I'm around, and I'm sorry that we didn't leave time for more questions at the end, but I'm very glad that you guys got involved and asked questions throughout. So hopefully I answered as many questions as I could, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Also, don't forget to fill out session evaluation so I know what I did wrong and to fix for the next time.
And door prizes.
Yes, and so you can win door prizes.